My boss cut my salary from $98,000 to $38,000, saying, "It's company-wide Dakota, nothing personal." I pulled out patent documents for the $50 million formula I'd developed in secret and watched his face go white. Let me explain exactly what Grayson Turner didn't know when he thought he was destroying my career that Tuesday morning. I'm Dakota Pierce, 36, materials engineer with 7 years at Brightstone Dynamics. What my boss assumed was a desperate employee living paycheck to paycheck was actually someone with $127,000 in savings, a side consulting business generating $2,400 monthly, and most importantly, a home laboratory where I'd been developing breakthrough adhesive technology for 3 years. The conference room fell silent as every department head stared at me processing the 61% salary cut. Grayson sat there with his fingers steepled, watching me like I was some lab rat in his corporate experiment. The paper in front of me read, "Organizational restructuring," but this wasn't restructuring. This was targeted elimination. "Nothing personal," he'd said. Right. That's why 3 other department heads were getting severance packages while I was the only one getting financially executed. That's why my lab access had been temporarily restricted 2 months ago. That's why my project budgets kept disappearing without explanation. But Grayson had made a critical error. He assumed I was just another disposable engineer who'd built his career on company resources. He had no idea about the 2,400 square foot workshop behind my downtown loft, the $47,000 worth of professional-grade equipment I'd accumulated, or the revolutionary cold cure adhesive formula that would make Brightstone's entire product line obsolete. "Let me think about it," I said, pushing back from the table. His eyebrows shot up like I'd suggested human sacrifice to improve quarterly earnings. "This isn't really a negotiation, Dakota." "Pay my mortgage with good intentions?" I stood up, grabbing my jacket. "I'm going to think about whether I want to work for 40% of what I'm worth, or find somewhere that appreciates what I bring to the table." I walked out, but not before catching the smug satisfaction on Grayson's face. He thought he'd won. He had no idea the war hadn't even started. The signs had been everywhere for 6 months. Budget meetings where my chair mysteriously disappeared. Projects reassigned to junior engineers without explanation. Equipment orders that never got approved. But the real confirmation came 3 weeks ago when I caught Grayson and VP Bradley Holt huddled over printouts of my lab notes in the break room. They scattered like roaches when they saw me, but I knew exactly what they were planning. They wanted to push me out and keep my work. That was their first mistake. I drove straight to my loft in my beat-up Honda Civic, took the freight elevator to the 8th floor, and headed to the back room that would change everything. Most people would call it storage space. I called it my insurance policy. For 3 years, I'd been working nights and weekends in that makeshift laboratory. Equipment bought at auctions with my consulting income. Chemicals ordered with personal funds. Notebooks filled with formulas that existed nowhere else in the world. Sarah Brennan, my patent attorney, had been helping me document everything with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday night in February. I'd been trying to solve the holy grail of industrial chemistry, creating structural adhesives that could cure at sub-zero temperatures without losing bond strength. Standard industrial glues need heat activation, which is useless if you're repairing an oil pipeline in Alaska or fixing a wind turbine in Montana winter. After months of failed attempts with different polymer chains and catalysts, I accidentally knocked over a beaker of experimental solvent into a batch of epoxy resin. Instead of ruining the mixture, it created something revolutionary, a gel that stayed workable at 40 degrees but formed molecular bonds stronger than traditional adhesives at room temperature. 4 months of refinement and testing later, I had something that could revolutionize cold weather construction and emergency repairs. More importantly, I had video documentation of every test, purchase receipts for all materials, and time-stamped lab notes proving independent development. The morning after Grayson's ambush, I called Sarah. "How fast can you file provisional patents?" "How fast do you need them?" she asked. "Yesterday would be good. Tomorrow's the latest." "Send me everything. We'll have 4 provisional patents filed by close of business." My home lab contained 3 years of work. Brightstone didn't know existed. The cold cure adhesive was just the beginning. I had formulas for impact-resistant sealants, temperature-stable compounds, and a revolutionary coating protecting metal from saltwater corrosion. Hundreds of hours of research, thousands in materials and equipment, all mine, all documented, all about to become legally bulletproof. Sarah called that afternoon. We're filing 4 provisional patents under your name. The cold cure formula is the crown jewel, but the others are solid too. Full protection within 24 hours. What about Brightstone claiming I used company resources? Let them try. Your documentation is cleaner than a surgical suite. They'll have to prove you used their equipment or time. From what I see, you've got enough evidence to bury that argument. I hung up and looked toward Brightstone's glass tower 5 miles east. From my window, it looked small enough to flick away. They thought they had me cornered, thought I'd take their insulting offer because I needed steady income. They were about to learn how spectacularly wrong they were. The next morning, I put on my best suit for what I figured would be my final employee meeting. Grayson had requested a follow-up to discuss my future with the company. The conference room was smaller this time, just him, Bradley Holt, and some HR woman I'd never met. "Dakota, thanks for coming in," Grayson said as I sat down. "Have you had time to think about our offer?" "I have," I replied, "and I've got a counterproposal." Bradley leaned forward. "We're not really in a position to negotiate salary adjustments right now." I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it between us. "This isn't about salary." The room went quiet. Grayson stared at the envelope like it might explode. "What's that?" the HR woman asked. I opened it and spread 4 patent applications across the table, like dealing cards in a high-stakes game. Licensing agreements for proprietary formulas I developed independently. The cold cure adhesive alone is worth about $50 million in annual revenue once it hits market. Grayson picked up one document, his face going pale as he read the technical specifications. "You can't. These were developed using company resources." I smiled. "Actually, no. Every single test was conducted in my private lab using materials I purchased myself. All development happened outside work hours. I've got video documentation going back 3 years. Bradley grabbed another sheet. "This is the sub-zero bonding compound. We've been trying to develop something like this for 7 years. And I've been working on it for Brightstone that entire time with zero progress," I said. "Turns out the real breakthrough needed a different approach, one that required working outside the constraints of your budget committees and approval processes." The HR woman looked confused. "I don't understand. Are you saying you want to license these patents to the company?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. Exclusive licensing rights for all 4 formulas. $50,000 per month per patent. That's $200,000 monthly, paid on the 1st of each month, starting immediately." The silence stretched for 10 seconds before Grayson found his voice. That's almost $2.5 million a year." "Correct. You're insane if you think we'd pay that much." I held up my hand. "Let me save you some time. The cold cure adhesive will capture about 60% of the emergency repair market within 2 years. Conservative estimates put that at $75 million annual revenue. The corrosion-resistant coating will revolutionize marine construction. The impact-resistant sealant will become the aerospace standard." I leaned back. $2.5 million is a bargain compared to what these formulas will generate. And that's assuming you can develop competing products, which you can't, because I own the underlying chemical processes. Bradley's jaw worked like he was chewing invisible gum. "Even if these patents are legitimate, we can't authorize that expenditure without board approval." "Then get board approval." "We need to review the formulas, verify effectiveness, run our own tests." "No," I said, gathering the documents. "You need to agree to licensing terms first. Review happens after you sign, not before. If you want independent tests, you can purchase samples at market rate once the licensing agreement is active." Grayson stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Dakota, be reasonable. We can't write you a check for $200,000 based on patent applications we haven't verified." I stood up, tucking the envelope under my arm. "Then I guess we don't have a deal." "Wait," the HR woman said. "What about your position here?" I looked at her like she'd asked me to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. "As of right now, I'm giving 2 weeks' notice. My last day will be—" I checked my phone. Friday, October 18th. You can't just quit, Bradley protested. You've got projects in progress. Actually, I can. Oregon is at will employment. And as for responsibilities, you just told me my work was worth $38,000 annually. I'm sure you can find someone at that salary level to handle whatever's left. I headed for the door, then stopped. Oh, one more thing. I've already accepted a position with Peakridge Industries. They were very interested in my background in advanced materials engineering. That was a lie, but they didn't need to know it. Grayson's face went red. Peakridge is our biggest competitor. Your non-compete clause doesn't apply to consulting arrangements, I interrupted. I won't be their employee. I'll be an independent contractor licensing my proprietary technology. Completely different legal framework. I left them sitting there with their mouths open like they were trying to catch flies. The truth was I hadn't talked to Peakridge yet, but I was about to. That afternoon, I researched every major player in industrial adhesives. Peakridge Industries had the resources to license my patents and the distribution network to bring them to market quickly, but they weren't the only option. 3 companies would kill for cold cure adhesive technology: Peakridge, Industrial Solutions Group, and Consolidated Materials. If I played this right, I could start a bidding war that would make Brightstone's licensing offer look like spare change. I called Peakridge first, asking for Catherine Wells, their head of R&D, who had a reputation for aggressive innovation. Ms. Wells, this is Dakota Pierce. I'm a materials engineer with proprietary technology that might interest your company. What kind of technology? Cold cure structural adhesives that maintain bond strength at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The line went quiet. That's not possible with current polymer chemistry. It wasn't possible, I corrected. I've developed a new catalytic system that changes the game entirely. Can you send technical specifications? I can do better. I can arrange a demonstration. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? She was. I spent that evening preparing samples of all 4 compounds. Small test batches that would prove the technology worked without revealing underlying formulas. Each sample went into a labeled vial with basic performance specifications, but no chemical composition data. The next day I drove to Peakridge headquarters in Beaverton with a cooler full of samples and a head full of confidence. Catherine Wells met me in their main conference room with 2 other engineers. Before we start, I said, setting the cooler on the table, everything you're about to see is proprietary and patent protected. I'll need signed NDAs from everyone in the room. They signed without argument. The demonstration took 2 hours. I showed them how the cold cure adhesive maintained structural integrity at temperatures that turned conventional glues into useless putty, how the corrosion-resistant coating protected steel samples submerged in salt water for months, how the impact-resistant sealant absorbed kinetic energy without cracking. By the time I finished, Catherine was leaning forward with her elbows on the table, eyes locked on the test samples. "This is revolutionary," she said. "How did you develop these formulations?" 3 years of independent research, all conducted outside my previous employment, fully documented and legally protected. Previous employment, Brightstone Dynamics? As of last week, one of the other engineers looked up from the cold cure sample he'd been examining. Brightstone's been trying to crack sub-zero bonding for years. You solved it working alone? Their approach was fundamentally flawed. They were trying to modify existing polymer chains instead of developing new catalytic systems. Sometimes you need to start from scratch instead of iterating on failure. Catherine nodded. What are you looking for? Employment? Partnership? Licensing? Exclusive rights to manufacture and distribute these compounds under my patents. I retain ownership of the underlying technology and collect royalties on everything sold. What kind of royalties? 15% of gross revenue for the cold cure system, 10% for the others. She didn't flinch. We'd need to verify these formulations at scale, run production tests. Of course, I'd provide technical support during scaling, and I'd be available for ongoing development and improvements. We talked for another hour about production timelines, market analysis, and competitive positioning. By the time I left, Catherine had promised to present my proposal to Peakridge's executive committee within the week. That same evening, I had similar conversations with Industrial Solutions Group and Consolidated Materials. Both companies were interested. Both wanted exclusive licensing deals. Both were willing to pay premium rates for technology that could give them competitive advantage. I was setting up a bidding war, and Brightstone wasn't even invited. Friday morning, my last day at Brightstone, I cleaned out my desk and said goodbye to colleagues who weren't avoiding me like I had something contagious. Most had heard rumors about my departure, but didn't know details. "Are you really going to Peakridge?" asked Janet from Quality Control. "Something like that," I said, dumping personal items into a cardboard box. "Heard Grayson's been in meetings with legal all week. Something about patent disputes." That got my attention. "Patent disputes?" "Don't know details, just saw lawyers going in and out of the conference room." I finished packing and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Grayson walking toward the legal department with folders under his arm and a grim expression. Let him scramble. He'd had 7 years to appreciate what I brought to the table. Now he could spend the next 7 figuring out how to replace it. That weekend, I got calls from all 3 companies. Peakridge offered exclusive licensing at 12% royalties plus a $500,000 signing bonus. Industrial Solutions Group countered with 15% royalties and consulting fees. Consolidated Materials wanted to buy the patents outright for $12 million. I turned them all down. "Counteroffer," I told Catherine Wells Monday morning. "Non-exclusive licensing to all interested parties at 20% royalties. No signing bonuses, no consulting requirements. I retain full patent ownership and the right to license to additional companies." "Non-exclusive? That means we'd be competing with everyone else who licenses the technology." "That's correct." "Dakota? That doesn't make business sense from our perspective. Why would we invest in scaling production if our competitors have access to the same formulations?" "Because the company that brings these compounds to market first captures the largest market share, because licensing fees are a fraction of what it would cost to develop competing technology, and because in 6 months, when demand exceeds supply, you'll be glad you got in early." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the real reason you're structuring it this way?" I looked toward Brightstone's building in the distance. "Let's just say I want to maximize the disruptive potential of this technology." By Wednesday, all 3 companies had agreed to my terms. Non-exclusive licensing at 20% royalties with production, beginning within 90 days. Conservative estimates put my annual income at somewhere north of $8 million once all 3 companies hit full production capacity. Not bad for someone supposedly not worth more than $38,000 annually. Thursday morning, Sarah called with interesting news. "Brightstone filed a lawsuit yesterday. They're claiming ownership of your patents based on intellectual property clauses in your employment contract." "Do they have a case?" "Not based on your documentation, but they're alleging you use company resources and time to develop the formulations. They want an injunction to stop licensing while the case is pending." I poured myself coffee and sat at my kitchen table. "How long does something like that usually take?" "Could be months, maybe longer if they drag it out." "What do they need to prove their case?" "Evidence that you use Brightstone equipment, materials, or work time to develop the patents. Email records showing research on company systems. Witness testimony from colleagues who saw you working on related projects during business hours." I smiled. "They're not going to find any of that." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've been planning for this possibility for 3 years. Every material purchase has a receipt with my personal credit card. Every piece of equipment in my lab has a dated invoice. Every test was conducted after hours and weekends. I've got security camera footage from my building showing me coming and going at all hours." "What about lab notes from work?" "Different projects entirely. I was working on heat-resistant compounds for high-temperature applications. The cold cure technology uses completely different chemical principles. There's no overlap." Sarah was quiet. "They might argue that your Brightstone work gave you foundational knowledge to develop the patents." "Let them try. General chemistry knowledge isn't proprietary. They'd have to prove I learned something specific at Brightstone that was essential to developing the cold cure system. Good luck with that." The lawsuit was filed that afternoon. Brightstone Dynamics versus Dakota Pierce, alleging theft of intellectual property and breach of employment contract. They wanted monetary damages, transfer of patent ownership, and an injunction preventing me from licensing the technology to anyone. I read through the complaint that evening, highlighting key allegations. Most was legal boilerplate, but a few sections caught my attention. Plaintiff alleges that defendant utilized proprietary knowledge gained during employment to develop competing products in violation of non-disclosure and intellectual property agreements. Defendant's patents were developed using foundational research conducted during work hours using company resources. Defendant's actions constitute unfair competition and tortious interference with business relationships. It was all speculation and legal posturing. They didn't have actual evidence because there wasn't any evidence to find, but the lawsuit served another purpose. It sent a signal to Peakridge and the other licensing companies that my patents might not be legally secure. That was a problem I needed to solve quickly. Friday morning, I called a meeting with all 3 licensing partners at a neutral location, a conference room I rented at a downtown hotel. Catherine Wells represented Peakridge. Dean Foster handled Industrial Solutions Group. Consolidated Materials sent their VP of Acquisitions, a sharp woman named Emery Blake. "I'm sure you've heard about the lawsuit," I said without preamble. "Brightstone is claiming ownership of my patents. I wanted to address this directly rather than let rumors complicate our agreements." Catherine spoke first. "Our legal team is concerned about the injunction. If a judge grants it, we won't be able to proceed with production." "The injunction won't be granted," I said. "Brightstone doesn't have evidence to support their claims, but even if they did, it would only delay production, not cancel it." Dean leaned forward. "What kind of evidence could they have?" "None that would hold up in court. The patents were developed independently using my own resources and time. I've got documentation to prove it." Emery looked skeptical. "Employment contracts usually include pretty broad intellectual property clauses. Are you sure there's no overlap?" I pulled out my laptop and opened a presentation I'd prepared that morning. "Let me show you exactly why Brightstone's case is going nowhere." The next hour was the most important presentation of my life. I walked them through every aspect of my patent development process, purchase receipts for equipment and materials, video timestamps showing after-hours work, chemical analysis proving my compounds were different from anything Brightstone had researched. I showed them the fundamental differences between my cold cure technology and the heat-based systems Brightstone had been trying to develop. Different catalysts, different polymer chains, different curing mechanisms. The only thing they had in common was that they were both adhesives. By the time I finished, the licensing partners looked satisfied. Catherine actually smiled. "This is exactly what our lawyers needed to see. The documentation is bulletproof." "What's our timeline for production?" Dean asked. "Assuming no further legal delays, we can begin scaling tests within 2 weeks. Full production capacity should be online within 90 days. Emery nodded. "And you're confident about market demand projections?" Conservative estimates put the emergency repair market at over $200 million annually. The cold cure technology will capture at least 30% within the first year. We spent another hour discussing production schedules, marketing strategies, and quality control protocols. By the time the meeting ended, all 3 companies had reaffirmed their commitment to the licensing agreements despite Brightstone's lawsuit. 2 weeks later, Sarah called with news that changed everything. Brightstone's legal team made a mistake. They filed under an emergency motion requesting immediate injunction. That means they had to provide their evidence up front, instead of going through normal discovery. That's good? It's very good because their evidence is pathetic. They've got some emails about general research directions, a few lab reports that don't relate to your patents, and testimony from Grayson Turner claiming you must have used company time because the patents are too sophisticated for someone working alone. That's it. That's it? No smoking guns, no actual proof, just speculation and sour grapes. My guess is they rushed the filing because they were trying to scare off your licensing partners before agreements became final. Did it work? Nope. I talked to Peakridge's lawyers this morning. They're proceeding with full production plans. The other companies are following suit. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. What happens next? We file a motion to dismiss the complaint and a countersuit for frivolous litigation. With any luck, this whole thing will be over within a month. That afternoon, I got a call from my former research assistant, Tommy Briggs. He'd been moved to a different department after my lab access got restricted, but we'd stayed in touch. "Dakota, you need to know what's happening over here," he said without preamble. "It's a complete disaster." "How so?" "They've got 3 different teams trying to reverse engineer your patents. They're working 16-hour days, burning through materials like crazy, and they're not even close." "What about the other projects I was working on?" "Dead in the water. The heat-resistant compound tests have failed 6 times in a row. The high-pressure sealant project got canceled. They're hemorrhaging money trying to replace what you were doing." I felt sympathy for my former colleagues. Good people caught in a management disaster they didn't create. "How's morale?" Tommy laughed, but it wasn't happy. 3 people have left in the last 2 weeks. Janet from quality control, Michael from testing, and Dr. Stevens from the polymer lab. Word is spreading that the company is in trouble. "What kind of trouble?" "Financial trouble. Quarterly projections are way off, and they're not hitting revenue targets they promised the board. Plus, they're spending a fortune on legal fees trying to fight your patents." That was interesting. If Brightstone was having cash flow problems, the lawsuit became even more desperate. They weren't just trying to protect intellectual property. They were trying to survive. Sarah's motion to dismiss was granted 3 weeks later. The judge threw out Brightstone's complaint entirely, calling it speculative and unsupported by credible evidence. Our countersuit for frivolous litigation was awarded $1.2 million in damages. The day the judgment came down, Catherine Wells called with production updates. "The first batch of cold cure adhesive is ready for field testing. Initial quality control results are exceeding specifications. Bond strength at 40 degrees Celsius is actually 20% higher than your samples indicated." "That's because the scaling process allows for better catalyst distribution," I explained. "Our sales team is already getting inquiries from major construction companies. Word is spreading about the Sub-Zero capabilities." 2 months later, Tommy called with news that made my victory complete. "Grayson got fired. Board meeting yesterday. He's out, effective immediately." I set down the beaker I'd been holding. "What happened?" "Quarterly earnings report came out. Revenue down 35%. Stock price in free fall. The board finally figured out that losing you was the beginning of the end. They brought in a consultant who basically told them that cutting your salary was the dumbest decision in company history." "Who's running things now?" "Interim CEO named Robert Fletcher. He's trying damage control, but it might be too late. 3 more people left this week, including Dr. Stevens. She got hired by Industrial Solutions Group, by the way." After I hung up, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret. Satisfaction because Grayson had finally faced consequences for his arrogance. Regret because good people were suffering for his mistakes. But I hadn't destroyed Brightstone Dynamics. I'd simply refused to let them destroy me. 6 months later, Brightstone filed for bankruptcy, unable to service debt after losing major contracts to competitors with better technology. The Portland Tribune ran a small article mentioning that several key employees had been hired by other companies in the industry, and that Brightstone's intellectual property assets were being sold to pay creditors. What the article didn't mention was that I'd purchased some of those IP assets through a shell company. Nothing related to my own patents, just manufacturing processes and testing protocols useful for future research. I'd also quietly hired 6 former Brightstone employees for my new company, Pierce Materials Engineering. Pierce Materials wasn't just a consulting firm. It was going to be a full-service materials development company handling everything from initial research through prototype development to production scaling for client companies. By the end of our first year, Pierce Materials Engineering had 15 employees, 3 patents in development, and annual revenue approaching $8 million. Not bad for a company that started in the basement of a converted warehouse. Tommy, now my head of research operations, knocked on my office door one day. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did you know Brightstone was going to fail when you left?" I leaned back in my chair. "I knew they were in trouble when they cut my salary. Companies don't slash their top performers' pay unless they're desperate. And desperate companies make increasingly bad decisions until they destroy themselves." "So you didn't cause their bankruptcy?" "I accelerated it. If Grayson had offered me a fair deal from the beginning, I might have licensed my patents to Brightstone instead of their competitors. They'd still be in business and I'd still be making $8 million annually. The only difference would be that 400 people would still have jobs. Do you ever feel bad about how it turned out? I looked out my window toward where Brightstone's building used to stand before demolition. I feel bad for people who lost jobs because of someone else's arrogance. I feel bad that a company with 7 decades of history disappeared because one man couldn't admit he was wrong. But do I feel bad about protecting my own interests when no one else would? No. 5 years later, I was reviewing financial reports when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized but hadn't seen in years. Hello, Grayson. Dakota, I wasn't sure you'd take the call. I almost didn't. What do you want? I wanted to apologize for how things ended at Brightstone, for the way I handled your situation. I gave him my full attention. Okay. I made bad decisions. I let the board pressure me into cutting costs instead of investing in people who were generating value. I should have fought for you instead of trying to squeeze you out. Yes, you should have. I know it's too late to fix what happened, but I wanted you to know that I realized I was wrong. I was quiet, trying to figure out why he was calling after all this time. Are you looking for forgiveness, Grayson? I don't know, maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to acknowledge that you were right and I was an idiot. You were definitely an idiot. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. Fair enough. Why now? Why call after 5 years? I saw an article about Pierce Materials in Industry Week. Your company is doing exactly what Brightstone should have been doing. Innovation, fair treatment of employees, sustainable growth. It made me realize what I threw away when I decided you were the problem instead of the solution. And now you're working in Seattle selling packaging solutions. Yeah, do you like it? It pays the bills, but every day I think about what Brightstone could have become if I'd made different choices. We talked for a few more minutes, but there wasn't much left to say. Grayson Turner had called, looking for resolution, some way to make peace with the biggest mistake of his career. But there was no going back, no way to undo choices that had led him from a corner office to a cubicle. After I hung up, I thought about the journey that brought me to this point. 7 years at Brightstone, watching my work get minimized. The moment when Grayson pushed too far and forced me to protect myself. The months of planning and patent development that turned a career disaster into a business empire. It hadn't been revenge exactly. Revenge would have been finding ways to hurt Grayson personally, or sabotaging Brightstone out of spite. What I'd done was simply refuse to be a victim. I'd taken control of my own destiny instead of letting someone else control it. Pierce Materials was now thriving with 120 employees across 3 facilities, patents licensed by companies in 17 countries, and annual revenue topping $50 million. The cold cure adhesive technology alone had generated over $200 million in global sales, earning me about $40 million in licensing fees. My assistant knocked on my door. Dakota, your 3 p.m. is here. Send them in. A young woman walked in, probably late 20s, wearing a nervous expression and carrying a folder of research notes. Mr. Pierce, I'm Alana Liu. I'm a materials engineer at Davidson Chemical. I was hoping to talk about a situation I'm having with my employer. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. What kind of situation? They're trying to force me to sign over patents for work I did on my own time, threatening my job if I don't comply. I heard about what happened with you and Brightstone, and I was hoping you might have some advice. I smiled and opened my notebook to a fresh page. Tell me everything from the beginning. Some stories end, others just keep going, rippling outward in ways you never expected. 20 minutes later, I was on the phone with Sarah Brennan, explaining Alana's situation and asking if she'd be interested in taking on another intellectual property case. It turned out there were a lot of Grayson Turners in the world, and a lot of Dakota Pierces who just needed someone to show them how to fight back. 6 months later, Pierce Materials launched its IP protection division with Alana Liu as the first client. We'd helped 12 engineers secure patents for work their employers had tried to claim, and we were getting inquiries from researchers across the country. The conference room was full for our quarterly meeting, 23 employees with 3 more starting next month. I looked around at faces that had become family. 5 years ago, I was sitting in a different conference room being told my work was worth 60% less than I thought, I began. The people making that decision figured I'd take it because I didn't have any other choice. I paused, looking around the room. They were wrong. I had lots of choices. I could have accepted their evaluation. I could have complained and argued. I could have quietly looked for another job. Instead, I chose to bet on myself, to build something better than what I was leaving behind. Tommy raised his hand. "What's the point of this inspirational speech, boss?" I grinned. "The point is that next month we're breaking ground on our new 50,000 square foot facility. State-of-the-art laboratories, expanded production capabilities, and office space for 200 employees." The room erupted in cheers. "More importantly," I continued when the noise died down, "every employee will receive equity shares in the new facility. When Pierce Materials grows, everyone grows with it." That got an even bigger reaction. After the meeting, I walked back to my office feeling the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from revenue numbers or patent approvals, but from building something that makes the world a little better for the people who are part of it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the news about your new facility. Congratulations. You built something amazing. G." I stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations were finished 5 years ago. I turned to my computer and started reviewing architectural plans for the new facility. Clean lines, efficient workflows, and something Brightstone Dynamics never had. Offices with windows for every employee, not just management. Because sometimes the best way to move forward is to remember exactly what you're leaving behind.